on the Omaha area's most notorious child killer, John Joubert. For the first time, the public will see the horrific drawings Joubert made while on death row.
He wore an Air Force uniform, earned merit badges, and blended in so completely that neighbors waved without a second thought. But here's the thing. Underneath that clean-cut image, John Joubert was a predator moving unnoticed across state lines. In late 1983, police followed a quiet trail that led from wooded neighborhoods to 3 murdered boys across 2 states. The collision was instant and terrifying. What would you have assumed if you passed him on the street?
Joubert 7 times in the 1980s and wrote the book A Need to Kill that experts say prove Joubert would have killed again.
But the story didn't begin with murder. It began earlier with warnings few took seriously. The Mask, Boy Scout, Airman, Trusted. By the time John Joubert reached his early 20s, the chaos of his childhood looked, from the outside, like it had settled. He wasn't drifting or bouncing between jobs. He wasn't hiding in the margins. He had structure. He had uniforms. First, the Boy Scouts, then something even heavier with symbolism, the United States Air Force. And here's the thing. In American culture, those 2 identities carry weight. They signal discipline, reliability, and someone who plays by the rules. People don't lean away from you when you wear them. They lean in. Joubert knew that, whether consciously or not. He joined the Air Force in 1981 and was stationed at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, just outside Omaha. Offutt wasn't some obscure post either. It was a major strategic air command base. Serious place. Serious people. And Joubert fit the image well enough that nobody saw a reason to look twice. Clean cut, quiet, polite. The kind of guy you'd describe as a little odd, maybe, but harmless. Exactly the kind of person you'd never connect to violence. And that's where the mask really did its work. Because uniforms don't just change how others see you, they change how much access you get. Joubert could move freely through neighborhoods without raising alarms. He could talk to people without suspicion hanging in the air. Parents didn't tense up when he was nearby. Kids didn't feel immediate danger. Trust filled the gaps where caution normally should have been. Now, here's where it gets more unsettling. Joubert wasn't tied down to one place. The Air Force gave him mobility, legitimate reasons to travel, and a built-in explanation for being new in town. In 1982, he was in Maine. In 1983, he was in Nebraska. 2 states, hundreds of miles apart, and no obvious reason for police departments to connect what would later happen in each location. Jurisdictional walls did the rest. Each place saw only a fragment of the picture. Remember that thing we talked about earlier? How warning signs had already shown up years before? Those didn't vanish. They just became invisible behind respectability. When someone looks the part, people reinterpret odd behavior as stress or shyness or just a personality quirk. Think about that for a second. Would you question someone more if they didn't look the part, or less? The Boy Scout connection adds another layer, and this is important to handle carefully. This wasn't about the organization itself. Millions of kids go through scouting without incident. What mattered here was the symbolism, the idea of service, morality, and trustworthiness. Joubert carried that reputation like a credential. It softened the edges, it lowered defenses, and in a quiet way, it helped him stay invisible. Court records later made it clear that none of the institutions around him had reason, at least on paper, to suspect what was coming. No active complaints. No criminal record followed him across state lines. Nothing screamed danger. And that's the most uncomfortable part of all. Respectability didn't just hide him, it protected him. Here's the thing about the Boy Scout image. It was a repair job. Before the Air Force, John Joubert was a deeply disturbed teenager in Portland, Maine, and the system actually caught him. They just didn't hold him. Around age 13, he started carrying a knife everywhere. He wasn't just a kid with a pocket knife. He was obsessed with the edge. He actually attacked a younger girl with a knife and slashed a boy in a separate incident. Now, here is where it gets frustrating. He was sent to a psychiatric facility, and the doctors there didn't mince words. They wrote down in black and white that he was a danger to himself and others, and that he had deep-seated aggressive impulses. But in the late 70s, the technical truth of forensic psychology was a bit of a mess. Because he was polite, did his chores, and looked like a good kid during sessions, they eventually checked a box and let him out. Think about that for a second. The red flags weren't just flapping in the wind. They were documented in a medical file. But when he joined the Air Force, that file didn't follow him. There was no central database for juvenile psychiatric holds. He walked into the recruitment office with a clean slate. The Air Force saw a young man with a high IQ and a disciplined background, and they handed him a uniform. That uniform didn't cure him. It just gave his darkness a hiding place. It was a massive institutional failure of communication that allowed a documented predator to be handed the keys to a strategic air command base. But that protection had an expiration date. Because once children started disappearing, the mask didn't just crack, it shattered. The murders across 2 states. The first time the mask truly failed, it happened quietly, the way these things almost always do. No alarms, no national headlines, just a missing child in a place that felt safe. In July of 1982, 12-year-old Ricky Stetson vanished from his neighborhood in Portland, Maine. He had been riding his bike, doing exactly what kids had done there for generations. When his body was later found in a wooded area, the shock settled in fast. This wasn't a random misfortune. This was something deliberate. And at the time, it stayed there, contained in Maine, sealed off as its own tragedy. Here's the part that's hard to sit with. When investigators looked for suspects, they did what made sense. They focused on locals, people with known histories, someone who stood out. John Joubert didn't fit. He was an airman passing through, quiet, polite, and already gone by the time questions started forming. Maine handled the case as Maine's problem, and without a clear suspect, it slowly went cold. Not forgotten, but suspended, waiting for something new to shake it loose. Now fast forward to the fall of 1983. Joubert was stationed in Nebraska by then, living near Offutt Air Force Base. On September 6th, 10-year-old Danny Joe Eberle disappeared while walking home from school in Papillion. His body was found days later in a wooded area. The community froze. Parents walked their kids everywhere. Police flooded neighborhoods. And for a brief moment, it felt like this case might break quickly. But it didn't end there. Less than 3 months later, on December 2nd, 12-year-old Christopher Walden vanished in nearby Bellevue. 2 towns, 2 children, 1 season. Suddenly, Nebraska wasn't dealing with an isolated crime anymore. They were dealing with a pattern, same age range, similar circumstances, similar locations. And still, nothing obviously pointed to a suspect who looked dangerous. When Danny Joe Eberle disappeared in September 1983, the town of Papillion didn't just get scared, it fundamentally changed. We're talking about a town where people didn't even know where their house keys were because they never used them. Suddenly, you had the FBI arriving, and the technical truth of the search was brutal. They used infrared sensors and massive grids of volunteers, but Joubert was stationed right there at Offutt. And get this, he was actually watching the search efforts. Because he was an airman, he had access to the local news and the chatter around the base. He knew exactly where the police were looking. While the community was paralyzed, he was refining his process. When Christopher Walden was taken just months later, it sent a message to the police that their current tactics weren't working. The pressure on the Sarpy County Sheriff's Office was insane. They were getting thousands of tips, ranging from suspicious vans to weird neighbors. But the technical reality is that they were buried in noise. They were looking for a monster that looked like a monster. They were checking the local drifters and the guys with criminal records. They weren't checking the 20-year-old Air Force radar technician who was showing up for his shifts on time and keeping his boots polished. The gap between the criminal profile and the technical reality of who Joubert was created a 3-month window where he was essentially untouchable. This is where geography did its quiet damage. Maine and Nebraska were investigating what they believed were separate cases, different police departments, different evidence rooms, different timelines. There was no immediate reason to connect a murder in New England to 2 killings in the Midwest. Back then, national databases weren't what they are now. Information moved slowly. Sometimes it didn't move at all. And think about what that meant in practice. Each state was missing part of the story. Maine had a victim and no suspect. Nebraska had 2 victims and mounting fear, but no clear lead that explained why this was happening. Joubert moved between these places under the cover of legitimate military orders. Nothing about his presence triggered alarms. Nothing about his appearance demanded scrutiny. The victims deserved to be remembered as more than case numbers. They were children with routines, families, and futures that stopped abruptly. The court records later laid out timelines with clinical precision, dates, locations, and sequences. But behind every line of legal text was a family waiting for answers that weren't coming fast enough. At some point, you have to ask it, even if the answer is uncomfortable. How many cases stay unconnected simply because they cross borders? Should serious violent crimes automatically trigger national coordination, even when there's no obvious link yet? By the time Nebraska investigators realized they were dealing with something bigger, weeks had passed. In Maine, the file sat quietly, unresolved. Geography hadn't caused the crimes, but it delayed justice. And while police were trying to connect dots across state lines, they were also chasing another problem entirely. They were looking for someone who fit the wrong profile. Profiling, mistakes, and the arrest. By late 1983, investigators knew they were dealing with something calculated, but they didn't know who. And here's the thing. The tools they leaned on felt cutting edge at the time. FBI criminal profiling was still relatively young, built from interviews and patterns gathered by people like Ann Burgess and her colleagues. It had promise. It also had blind spots. In the Joubert case, those blind spots mattered. Early profiles leaned towards someone local, someone older, maybe a teacher, a coach, or a familiar authority figure embedded in the community. That made sense on paper. The crimes involved children. The access seemed personal. So the police chased that logic. They questioned neighbors. They scrutinized men who already felt suspicious. And while that was happening, John Joubert sat just outside the frame, blending into military housing, commuting to work, and living an ordinary routine that didn't trigger alarms. Now here's where it gets interesting. Profiling didn't fail because it was useless. It failed because it narrowed vision too much. Joubert didn't match the emotional image investigators expected. He wasn't outwardly domineering. He wasn't publicly unstable. He didn't insert himself into searches or media coverage. He stayed quiet. And that quietness, ironically, helped him slip past the very systems designed to catch people like him. The break didn't come from a dramatic breakthrough or a brilliant deduction. It came from something almost painfully ordinary. On December 3rd, 1983, the day after Christopher Walden disappeared, a Bellevue police officer noticed a car parked near a wooded area. That alone wasn't enough to justify much, but it was odd. The officer ran the plates and learned the car belonged to an Air Force airman stationed at Offutt, John Joubert, a name that hadn't been anywhere near the top of any list. When police brought Joubert in for questioning, things started shifting. His explanations didn't quite line up. Small inconsistencies appeared. Once that Bellevue officer, Tan Fawcett, spotted Joubert's white Chevy Nova, the game changed, but it wasn't over. When Joubert sat down in that interrogation room, he didn't look like a serial killer. He looked like a bored kid. Here is where the interrogation got technical. The investigators didn't lead with the murders. They led with the car. They asked him why he was parked near the woods, where Christopher Walden's body was found. Joubert tried to play the innocent airman card. He claimed he was just out for a drive or looking for a place to think. But the detectives noticed something. When they mentioned Maine, his composure didn't just crack, it evaporated. They noticed he had a very specific type of hunting knife in his possession, an Explorer brand knife with a serrated edge. This was the technical truth that linked the states. The wounds on the boys in Nebraska matched the unique serration of that knife. And, critically, they matched the unsolved wounds on Ricky Stetson from Maine. Wait, it gets weirder. During the confession, Joubert was almost clinical. He didn't show remorse. He showed interest. He spoke about the crimes as if they were a series of technical problems he was trying to solve. He admitted that the Boy Scout training actually helped him with the knots he used and the way he moved through the woods. He was using the very skills society taught him to be a good man, to become a more efficient killer. That realization in the interrogation room was a gut punch to the investigators. And then forensic evidence entered the picture. Investigators had bite mark impressions from one of the Nebraska victims. Dental impressions were taken from Joubert and compared. At the time, bite mark analysis was considered reliable, a serious scientific tool. The match gave police the confidence to keep pushing. And get this, once Joubert was confronted with the evidence, the walls came down. He confessed to the Nebraska murders. Later, when details emerged that matched the unsolved Maine case from the year before, investigators finally saw the full shape of what they were dealing with. 2 states, 3 children. One offender had moved freely between them under the cover of routine military life. Think about that for a second. Profiling narrowed the search. Chance widened it again. A parked car, an observant officer, a forensic method that, at the time, carried enormous weight. The arrest was as accidental as it was scientific. Systems didn't click perfectly into place. They stumbled forward until something finally held. Do you trust criminal profiling today, knowing how much of this case hinged on coincidence as much as calculation? By the time John Joubert was officially charged, the mystery of who had done it was solved. But another process was just beginning, because the arrest didn't end the story. It shifted it into courtrooms, appeals, and a legal fight that would stretch on for years. Trials, execution, and what lingered. Once John Joubert was in custody, the chaos narrowed into procedure. Courtrooms replaced search parties. Timelines became exhibits. In Nebraska, he was tried first for the murders of Danny Joe Eberle and Christopher Walden. The evidence was methodical. His own confessions, forensic testimony, and the quiet weight of facts that no longer needed speculation. The jury didn't take long. In 1984, Joubert was convicted and sentenced to death. A year later, Maine followed with its own trial for the murder of Ricky Stetson, closing the legal loop across 2 states. But the story didn't rush to an ending. It slowed down. Appeals moved through the courts for more than a decade, raising questions about sentencing standards, definitions of cruelty, and the limits of punishment itself. Judges parsed language. Lawyers argued nuance. Meanwhile, families waited. Justice, when filtered through the system, takes time. Sometimes an exhausting amount of it. Joubert was executed in Nebraska on July 17, 1996. He was 33 years old. The state called it the end of a case. On paper, it was. No more hearings, no more filings. But outside the courtroom, the damage didn't vanish with the final ruling. It settled into communities that had already learned how fragile normal life could be. Years passed. New families moved into Papillion and Bellevue. Kids rode bikes down the same streets. And yet, the case never fully disappeared. In 2023, Sarpy County announced plans to memorialize the boys murdered in 1983, creating a permanent reminder not just of what was lost, but of why it mattered. That decision alone says something important. People were still carrying this decades later. There's another layer that keeps resurfacing, and it's uncomfortable. Joubert's name occasionally returns through court debates about his artwork, drawings he created while on death row, and whether such material should circulate at all. Nebraska courts have weighed those questions recently. Not because anyone wants to glorify him, but because society still wrestles with how to handle the remnants of violence once the violence itself is over. And that brings up the hardest part. Does punishment ever truly resolve trauma? The legal system delivered its verdict. The sentence was carried out. But the aftermath stretched far beyond the execution chamber. Families learned to live with absence. Towns learned to live with memory. Institutions quietly reassessed what they missed. Outreau John Joubert's story wasn't just about evil hiding in plain sight. It was about assumptions left unchallenged and warning signs brushed aside because everything looked normal enough. Prevention is quieter than punishment and far less dramatic, but it's where lives are actually saved. What warning signs do we still ignore today? If this story stayed with you, keep an open mind and explore the other cases where systems failed long before anyone noticed.